Welcome back to the JDG. This is the third seminar for Michaelmas term, and today we have the pleasure to be joined by Professor Michaelmas Vrousalis. Michaelmas Vrousalis is an associate professor in practical philosophy at Erasmus University Rotterdam, and is here today to present a paper called Domination at Work.
Thank you all for coming. I was explaining to Mauricio and Andreas, it's been 15 years since I last gave a talk at the JDG, so it's a pleasure to be here for that reason as well. I can recognize myself in many of you. Old man, take a look at my life. I'm a lot like you were, as the song goes. So what I'd like to do today is talk a little bit about the main claims of a book I've been writing on exploitation. And the book basically defends three theses. The first thesis the book defends is that unlike what many philosophers think and many economists think, exploitation is a form of domination. So it is a dividend the powerful extract from the servitude of the vulnerable through power over them. And this servitude, I argue in the book, is unilateral control over alien purposiveness, the ability to set and pursue ends. If you're a Rawlsian, you want something narrower, the two moral powers, or whatever that is. That's the first claim of the book. The second claim of the book is about specifically exploitation at work. And the second claim of the book is that dominators at work make claims to unilateral control over alien labor, the ability of others to work, such that exploitation at work is what happens when the exploiter exercises that claim, that is, uses her control over the exploitee's alien purposiveness to squeeze out unilateral labor flow. So the exploitee works for the exploiter, producing surplus labor, which the exploiter appropriates just by dint of power over the exploitee. So the second argument that I defend in the book attempts to sort of restore the dignity of labor in the debates on exploitation, the dignity of labor as a conceptual category that can do the work we needed to do when we think about productive relations between humans. And finally, the book defends the view that capitalism is a specific form of that claim to alien purposiveness. It is monetized control over that purposiveness, and to use the obscure German wording, but which carves out a conceptual space. It is a form of reification, unilateral control over the productive purposiveness of others in the form of a relation between things, the form of money. So capitalist, the thought is someone who has a monetized claim, monetized title to unilateral control over the productive purposiveness of others. And the paper uses these arguments and these thoughts to and juxtaposes them with a lot of the contemporary literature on exploitation, and the specific target here is, of course, the broadly, let's say, analytical Marxist conception of exploitation. Arneson was not a Marxist, but he belongs in that group, broadly speaking. Cohen and, of course, John Romer, who has basically dominated the economics and the philosophy literature with his writings on exploitation over the past 30 years or more. And the book also uses these thoughts to talk a little bit about structural domination, phenomena like the patriarchy, exploitation of sexual labor and organ markets, and also tries to speak a little bit to international and intergenerational relations. But what I'll do today is take you through an orthodox, let's say, account of exploitation, basically Romer's, and use that as a foil for developing my alternative view. So what I'll do now is just share with you a set of slides, and I'll take you through the argument there. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is just take you through some thoughts that I think paint a picture, at least, of what this book is about and what I'm trying to do in writing it. One of the central thoughts, I take it, of the socialist tradition, and one of the things that have always motivated me politically, morally, and so on, is a stanza from Brecht's Song of the United Front, which says that because a person is a person, she doesn't need a boot to the face. She wants no slaves under her and no masters above. I think this is basically it. I mean, just by dint of being human, you have entitlements to not having masters above you, and others have similar entitlements, which implies that you also can be a master. They also can be slaves below you. And so I think the core, the crux of the socialist tradition is pretty much captured by this Brechtian dictum. But of course, how this is spelled out is important. And there's a very widely held elaboration of the Brechtian dictum in the literature, which is effectively due to Jerry Cohen and John Romer. So what I'm going to do now is basically share with you some of the fundamentals of Romer's account of exploitation by using a very simple model of economic reproduction, say a little bit about what Romer makes of it, and say what the alternative that I want to defend looks like. So Romer makes his moves by using a simple economic model. I won't take you through the specifics and the technical details. They're not necessary for our purposes today, especially if you've read the chapter. That's completely superfluous. But it does matter that Romer contrasts and begins a lot of his work on exploitation begins by contrasting two sets of productive arrangements. One, which is collective ownership, and which involves a very rudimentary division of labor, in which there's some seed corn in a corn-producing economy, and that seed corn, the capital stock, let's say, the means of production, is collectively owned. And Romer shows that in this economy, under certain very simple assumptions about preferences and market clearing, which one might take issue with, but let's do that in the Q&A. There's an equilibrium in this economy, and the equilibrium is one in which every member of the economy works an equal amount of time. In this case, each peasant works for 2 days, And this equilibrium is completely egalitarian and Pareto efficient. In this economy, the peasants who produce the seed corn, who produce the corn rather, work for a total of 2,000 days. And what's important here is that Romer wants to contrast this economy and this equilibrium with an equilibrium under capitalist ownership, equilibrium in an economy in which the 1% owns the seed corn, the means of production. And he shows that in this economy, there's going to be a very inegalitarian distribution of the seed corn, of corn, and that in this economy also some people are going to work a lot more than others. The total labor time in this economy, if you stick to these assumptions, is 970 days greater than in the previous one. And so Romer infers from all this, in elaborating what he thinks is Marx's view on these issues, the extra 970 days of labor expended by peasants is surplus labor, and its existence comprises exploitation. In other words, with private and unequal ownership of the capital stock, peasants must work 50% longer for the same consumption they receive with ownership of capital. Now, not much has been said yet about what this thing is, what exploitation is, why it's objectionable, and so on. But Romer is going to say something about this. So here are three revisionist claims that Romer is going to assert. It must be admitted, I'll read it. I'll read the whole quotation. It must be admitted contra Marx that there are many instances of capital accumulation through hard work or inventiveness, and it is not obvious why the hiring of workers to labor on this honestly accumulated capital and their consequent exploitation should be considered an instance of injustice. We have no argument from Marx that the existence of exploitation and profit is as such condemnable, and it is noteworthy that Marx was sensitive to this problem, for he spent many pages of Capital arguing that the accumulation of capital came about through robbery of one form or another, rather than honest hard work or ingenuity. And so one way to assemble and decompose these claims is as follows: that exploitation is objectionable if and only if it issues from distributive injustice, robbery of one form or another, that if capitalism is to count as exploitative, then it must come about through such injustice, and that Marx affirms this second claim, which is explained by his being sensitive to the first. I'm not going to discuss the third claim today. So what I want to do is basically use the first two claims to criticize Romer and then explain why I think we should go back to something like the Marxian view. And I'll explain what that is on my reading. So Romer affirms the first claim, the idea that exploitation is objectionable if and only if it is from distributive injustice, because he affirms the idea, sometimes called luck egalitarianism, that it is bad because unfair if someone is worse off than another through no fault or choice of her own. And I think Romer thinks this responsibility constraint posited by this view is both a sufficient and a necessary condition for justice. I used to think that Romer affirms the second claim, the claim that capitalism, if it is to count as exploitative, then it must come about through such injustice. He affirms this view because he affirms Nozick's principle, such that if a distribution D2 issues from a distribution D1, where D1 is just, and we get from D1 to D2 through just steps, then D2 is itself just. But he's recently written a book where he tries to disavow that view by appeal to the value of community. The title of the book is How We Cooperate. So I'm not going to talk about two very much. I think something like two is lurking in the background of a lot of what Romer has to say about distributive justice, but we can talk about that in the Q&A. So what I'm going to do now is basically set out a couple of arguments against Romerian revisionism, and then explain what I think we should do, what the positive view is, which I take it to be basically a variation of a set of arguments that Marx develops in his mature writings, but you can also find in Kant's Doctrine of Right and in Hegel's Philosophy of Right. So here's the negative argument. The negative argument, basically, I'll just give you the negative argument, the argument against one, against the claim that exploitation rather requires distributive injustice, that distributive injustice is both necessary and sufficient for unjust exploitation. So the argument against the necessity idea, the idea that distributive injustice is necessary for exploitation, is basically the pit case. The pit case is a case in which two people find themselves in the middle of a desert. One falls into a pit, and then the other guy comes over and says, I'm going to get you out if and only if you work for me for the rest of your life for a sweatshop contract. This kind of arrangement might be forthcoming against perfect background justice. The guy in the pit may have failed to purchase costless or very cheap insurance against falling in pits. And yet, she's still exploited. So that's the presumptive counterexample against necessity. The presumptive counterexample against sufficiency of distributive injustice for exploitation, is an example from Romer himself. It's the rich and poor case. And the rich and poor case goes something like this. Rich is capital rich, poor is capital poor, but rich has a prodigious appetite for producing, whereas poor only wants to write poetry all day. So what happens is that rich works up all of her capital stock and then goes over to poor and hires herself out to poor as a wage laborer in return for working on her field. Romer thinks that there's no exploitation in the rich and poor case, even though there is an unjust distribution. Unjust distribution does not suffice for unjust exploitation. This is a presumptive counterexample to the sufficiency idea. Now, if we drop the Romerian characterization of exploitation, then we have to come up with an alternative. And what I try to do in the book is develop and defend that alternative. So the positive argument that I defend in the book goes something like this. The thought is that the central concern of Marxian socialism, I've belatedly come to realize that it's not just Marxian, could be Kantian or Hegelian, is an equal control over the labor capacity of others. So the underlying idea is that under mandatory social cooperation, there's a presumption in favor of your being able to bind others to as much and as good labor as they can bind you. And so the way to buttress this thought might be the non-servitude proviso. The non-servitude proviso says that for any agents or groups of agents engaged in mandatory mutually affecting cooperation, none should possess unilateral control over the labor of any other. Now, there's some caveats about the proviso. The first is we need to figure out what unilateral control is. What does it mean to unilaterally control the labor of others and their ability, their productive purposiveness, their ability to set and pursue productive ends. And in the book, I just do some hand waving and say, here's a Kantian reading of unilateral control. Here's a Republican reading. Here's a recognitive reading. The Republican reading would have to say something like, a capitalist necessarily has arbitrary power over the wage laborer and therefore dominates her. A Kantian would have to say something like, the kind of control the capitalist has over the worker is not expressive of omnilateral authorization in the right way. It does not express public power in everyone's name in the right way, and therefore constitutes a form of domination of the worker. And then the recognitional or a cognitive argument would have to say something like, in subsuming your labor your labor capacity as a wage laborer, I fail to take take your purposiveness itself as a reason for treating you in a certain way. These are all ways of spelling out the unilateral control clause in the labor condition, and the book obviously does not have very much to say about this extensively, because my concern is to shift the burden of proof from the fairness view to a more domination-like view, a domination-rich view. But we can discuss these things in the Q&A. I think one important implication of the proviso is that it establishes a presumptive case, a prima facie case against unilateral control over the purposiveness, the productive purposiveness of others, such that even in an Ozickian situation in which there's an initially just, by like egalitarian lights, an initially just distribution, which sets in motion a situation in which we get another distribution through just steps. The resulting distribution might still itself be unjust. And so I think one of the interesting implications of the proviso is that it is not justice preserving, let's say, or justice preserving by egalitarian lights. So here are some why do this? Why go through all the pain of doing it? One reason to do it is that the fairness view seems not to capture salient but morally relevant intuitions and cases like the Pitt case, like the rich and poor case, and so on. Another reason to go to the domination view, to think that exploitation is not about unfairness, but it is rather about the subsumption of the purposiveness of others, this unilateral benefit through the subsumption of the purposiveness of others, is that this is actually the way in which non-philosophers have thought about on freedom in connection with other modes of production. You know, the subsumption of purposiveness is not exclusive to capitalism. There's slavery, there's patriarchy, there's feudalism, and so on. All of these systems seem to involve subsumption of purposiveness. And if we think about domination in terms of that subsumption, maybe we can make progress in thinking, in understanding the specificities of these different modes of production. And finally, I think one final more, let's say, conceptual or terminological way of making progress here, and a reason why we should opt for the domination theory, is that it gives us a new glossary. It allows us to think of Brecht's original dictum in new terms. And so we can use that thought, that idea rather, that exploitation is about the subsumption of the purposiveness of others, rather the extraction of benefit through the subsumption of the purposiveness of others, allows us to talk about alienation, for example, which, as you know, figures in all kinds of literatures, but no one really knows what it is. There's as many definitions of alienation as there are philosophers. But we can think, on the terms that I'm defending, we can think of alienation just as unilateral control over alien purposiveness. Sure, there's a lot of things that are resolved here, including what unilateral control, alien, and well, not alien, but purposiveness is. So these three terms need to be figured out and precisified, but we have a rough and ready definition of alienation. We also have a rough and ready definition of exploitation. It just is the exercise of that control in the form of unilateral labor transfer. And finally, this very obscure notion that has figured in critical theory and social philosophy from Lukács to Honneth, the notion of reification. And then again, if you go with a domination, you can just say it's the form that alienation assumes under capitalism. It's a claim to alien purposiveness in the form of a thing. So these are just some sketchy remarks as to what I'm trying to do in the book and why I think the domination account is a serious contender as an alternative to the dominant fairness account of exploitation. Thanks for your attention.